Tonight we slip into the flickering candlelit parlour of Victorian England, where walls gleam with a shade of green so intense it feels almost supernatural. You tilt your head, drawn in by that lush colour, emerald, velvet, seductive, and then the reality sets in. The very air you're breathing is laced with poison. This is no cozy interior, it's a death trap disguised as elegance. And you probably won't survive this redecorating project, though I suppose that makes it more exciting. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Now, dim the lights, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. The Victorians had a peculiar obsession, chasing the perfect shade of green paint. Not just any green, mind you, but a color that popped so vividly it seemed pulled straight from fairy tales or enchanted forests. Picture a countryside stroll in summer, that moment when the sunlight hits leaves just right, and you think, wow, that's the real green. Victorians wanted that, indoors, permanently. And thanks to a chemist's unfortunate brilliance, they got it, with a side serving of arsenic. You tread across patterned carpets and rest your gaze on walls smothered in emerald green. Guests in these parlors would gush about the freshness of the color, how alive it looked compared to the dull browns and grays of earlier decades. In a time before electric lights, bright paint transformed dark rooms into spaces that seemed to glow. It was, in every sense, intoxicating. Sadly, that word wasn't just poetic. The pigment's official name was Scheele's green or, later, Paris green. Both were arsenic-based, cooked up in laboratories where powdered minerals mingled with deadly chemistry. Historians still argue whether Victorians fully understood the risks or simply ignored them, but one thing's certain, the shade was irresistible. People craved it in wallpapers, curtains, dresses, even food coloring. Imagine your frosted cake decorated with just enough arsenic sparkle to send you to the doctor. Talk about a killer dessert. Mainstream history often paints Victorians as prudish and cautious, but their decorating choices suggest otherwise. Here they were, willingly coating their walls in a pigment so lethal it could cause vomiting, fainting, or even death. One quirky tidbit. Some households noticed their green wallpaper actually changed color as damp air reacted with the pigment, releasing arsenic gas. Think of it like a deadly mood ring plastered across your walls. When you look closely, you realize this obsession wasn't just about aesthetics, it was about status. A family with freshly painted green walls sent a message: we are fashionable, we are modern, we can afford imported pigments. Never mind the faint headaches or that strange cough developing in the children. The neighbors would be impressed, and wasn't that what really mattered? Factories were eager to meet demand, churning out gallons of the stuff. Paint catalogs boasted of verdant brilliance and unfading luxury. You can almost hear the sales pitch. Yes, this shade will make your parlor the envy of the street. Of course, they skipped over the part about arsenic powder drifting invisibly into lungs. That detail wasn't exactly marketing friendly. Imagine you lean closer to a wall freshly painted with emerald green. It smells faintly metallic, a tang that scratches your throat. You run your hand across the surface, and a fine dust clings to your fingertips. Later, as you rub your eye, irritation blooms. Hours pass, and the nausea creeps in. That's the invisible price of beauty, one many Victorians paid without ever connecting the dots. Historians debate whether the government or scientists should have stepped in earlier, but in the mid-1800s, consumer safety laws were practically non-existent. If it sold, it stayed. If people got sick, well, maybe they just had weak constitutions. You can sense the denial humming beneath the polished Victorian exterior. People wanted to believe in progress, and progress looked green. There's a strange irony here. While Victorians worried obsessively about moral decay and proper etiquette, they cheerfully decorated nurseries with a pigment that could knock a child unconscious. It's as if the era said, No elbows on the table, darling, and don't lick the wallpaper. Not that anyone listened. Children do what children do, and green toys or painted books must have looked irresistible. One notable case, whispered in newspapers of the time, involved a little girl who slept in a room covered with green wallpaper. Each morning, she woke weaker, her skin pale, her stomach aching. Doctors suspected typhoid or bad air, but never the walls. By the time suspicions arose, the damage was done. Stories like this circulated, sometimes hushed, sometimes sensationalized, but rarely acted upon. And yet, despite the tragedies, the allure of green persisted. You find yourself standing in a Victorian showroom, glass chandeliers above, mahogany chairs polished, and everywhere the shimmer of emerald green. People gasp and point, their faces lit with admiration. The salesman beams. The toxic truth lingers in silence. As you sink deeper into this world, you can almost sympathize. After centuries of muted, natural pigments, muddy ochres, dull browns, faded blues, suddenly there was a color so brilliant it felt alive. Who wouldn't be tempted? Beauty has always demanded a price. In this case, it was measured in coughs, dizziness, and lives cut short. Still, the Victorians pressed on, wrapping their lives in this verdant glow. The poison lurking beneath the surface didn't yet have a name they believed in, only whispers, only rumors. And so, as the candles gutter and the wallpaper gleams, you find yourself caught between awe and unease. This green is magnificent, and it will not forgive you for loving it. You step out of the glittering parlor and onto a foggy London street, boots tapping along the cobbles as gas lamps cast weak halos in the mist. The city hums with energy, steam engines wheeze, horses clatter, vendors shout, and at the heart of it all, a swelling middle class is hungry for beauty. Not just comfort, not just shelter, but beauty in every corner of their homes. Factories are rising everywhere, brick chimneys belching smoke into skies already thick with soot. Industrial Britain is noisy, dirty, and astonishingly productive. For the first time, ordinary families, clerks, shopkeepers, small merchants have just enough disposable income to buy things once reserved for aristocrats. And what do they want? Color. Color that says, we've made it. In earlier centuries, pigments were limited, expensive, and frustratingly quick to fade. A cheerful yellow could dull to beige, a lively red might turn muddy after a few years. But now, chemical innovation promised permanence and brilliance. Paint companies smelled opportunity. You find yourself flipping through a Victorian paint catalogue, pages heavy with florid descriptions, a green as fresh as spring meadows, a tone unmatched in the natural world. The names alone sound intoxicating. And yet, there's something almost desperate in this pursuit. The Industrial Revolution was grimy, smog-blackened curtains within weeks, coal dust gathered in lungs. People longed for escape. If you couldn't flee to the countryside, why not import its lushest color right onto your walls? Emerald wallpaper could create the illusion of a garden indoors, even as chimneys choked the actual landscape outside. Historians still argue whether this craving was purely aesthetic or also psychological, a need to balance the darkness of factory life with something vivid and hopeful. Either way, the market was ravenous. Green pigments flew off shelves, tucked under arms of ladies in bonnets and men in stiff hats. A new home without a splash of green felt incomplete, even unfashionable. One quirky tidbit: paint wasn't just slapped onto walls. It coated carriages, furniture, even bird cages. Imagine a parrot swinging inside a bright green cage, inhaling arsenic fumes while chirping cheerfully. Birds didn't always fare well. More than a few keeled over mysteriously, leaving owners puzzled. Perhaps Polly didn't want a cracker after all. But this mania for green wasn't universal. In working-class neighborhoods, walls remained bare plaster or lime-washed white, cheap, safe, and dull. It was the aspiring middle class, straining to impress, who embraced emerald pigment with both arms. You can picture the dinner party conversations. Oh yes, the Thompsons just redid their drawing room in the most delightful Paris green. Simply dazzling. One does hate to be left behind. Of course, what dazzled to the eye often irritated the body. Guests might leave these homes with headaches, sore throats, or a lingering fatigue. Nobody dared blame the wallpaper. Illness was always attributed to bad air, weak nerves, or perhaps the neighbor's questionable cooking. The green walls remained innocent in everyone's minds. As you wander through a bustling Victorian shop, you notice how paints and wallpapers are marketed not as dangerous chemicals but as social climbing tools. Displays promise the very shade adorning London's finest drawing rooms. Buyers beam with pride at the thought of copying elite tastes. The clerk dips his brush in a sample pot, smears a stripe of emerald across a wooden board, and your heart actually flutters. The color is hypnotic. That's the trick, it bypasses logic and goes straight for desire. There's also the thrill of novelty. This was an age of progress, after all. Railways shrank distances, telegrams zipped words across countries, and pigments like emerald green announced themselves as marvels of modern science. Why question the gift of chemistry? To doubt progress would be almost unpatriotic. And yet, in quiet corners, rumors stir. A servant falls ill after scrubbing a newly painted banister. A seamstress coughs relentlessly while sewing green-dyed ribbons. A baker complains that the icing sugar, tinted with just a hint of green, makes him dizzy. But who would listen to servants, seamstresses, or bakers? They lived at society's margins, their voices easy to ignore. You can almost sense the future press scandal brewing, though it hasn't erupted yet. For now, the craze accelerates. Green paint adorns nurseries, theaters, hotels, even churches. Imagine kneeling in prayer, your eyes wandering over an altar framed with emerald detail, while unseen toxins drift lazily through the incense-thick air. A holy haze with an unholy ingredient. By the late 1840s, green is no longer just a color, it's a social necessity. Families save for months to redecorate a single parlor. Mothers boast about their healthy, natural tones, oblivious to the irony. Fathers admire how the walls gleam even by candlelight. Children play beneath them, small lungs taking in what adults cannot see. And you feel torn between admiration and dread. The green does look spectacular, fresh, vibrant, alive in a way other pigments cannot match. It transforms dim rooms into spaces that feel almost enchanted. But once you know the secret, you can't unsee it. Every shimmering wall becomes a silent accomplice, smiling brightly as it slowly does its work. As night deepens, you leave the shop and stroll back into the mist. Through curtained windows you glimpse families gathered around glowing fireplaces, their walls alive with emerald light. They look content, unaware. For now, the market's hunger is sated, the dream of beauty fulfilled. But beneath it all, danger is waiting, patient and green. You push open a creaking laboratory door, the air thick with the smell of minerals, smoke, and something sharper that stings your nose. Inside, it's 1775, and a Swedish chemist named Carl Wilhelm Scheele hunches over glass flasks, utterly unaware that history is about to take a lethal turn. He isn't dreaming of interior design trends or fashionable parlors, he's simply tinkering with copper compounds, searching for brighter, more stable colors. And by accident, or perhaps destiny, he creates Scheele's green. The pigment is dazzling. Compared to earlier greens made from ground malachite or plant-based dyes, this one practically glows. You lean closer to his sample sheet, and the swatch radiates with life, a shade so saturated it feels like touching summer leaves in their prime. To Scheele, it's a scientific triumph. To future Victorians, it's an irresistible temptation. To countless unsuspecting people, it's a slow-motion tragedy. The recipe is deceptively simple. Copper arsenite, a compound born from copper salts and arsenic trioxide. At the time, arsenic wasn't considered an outright villain. Apothecaries prescribed it in small doses for ailments ranging from fevers to skin conditions. Some even thought it boosted vitality, because who wouldn't want a health tonic that doubles as rat poison? Historians still argue whether Scheele knew his pigment was dangerous. Some suggest he realized the fumes were noxious but assumed careful handling made it safe. Others claim he dismissed the risk entirely, focusing only on the brilliance of the color. Either way, he didn't patent his creation. He left it for others to replicate, refine, and profit from, never imagining his discovery would one day hang in the parlors of London or the ballrooms of Paris. One quirky tidbit: Scheele himself was notorious for tasting the chemicals he worked with. Yes, actually licking them, as if laboratory experiments were some Victorian wine-tasting tour. Considering that he died relatively young, just 43, many speculate his reckless sampling habits played a role. Imagine casually dipping a finger into arsenic-laced powder and thinking, a bit metallic, but promising. Definitely not FDA approved. As word of the pigment spread, manufacturers leapt at the chance to replicate it. Painters and decorators raved about how well it covered surfaces, how vividly it lasted, how affordable it was compared to rare mineral pigments. By the early 1800s, Scheele's green was already in wallpaper factories, artist palettes, and, bizarrely enough, sweet shops. Picture a frosted marzipan cake decorated in a green so lush it seems ripped from an oil painting, then imagine the guests slowly clutching their stomachs afterward. Party favors, Victorian style. But Scheele's pigment had a flaw: it wasn't entirely stable. Under damp conditions, the arsenic compound could react and release toxic gas. Picture it: on a humid summer's evening, the wallpaper in your sitting room essentially breathes poison into the air. People noticed musty odors or odd symptoms: burning eyes, persistent coughs, rashes, but few connected the dots. After all, who suspects the walls? You glance at the chemist's cluttered workspace again. Vials of powders, open flames, and no protective gear whatsoever. His world was one of trial and error, where progress mattered more than safety. It's easy to judge now, but at the time, the line between medicine, poison, and pigment was blurry. If arsenic could cure ailments in tiny amounts, surely painting with it wasn't too risky. Or so they told themselves. By the early 19th century, Scheele's green gave way to an even brighter cousin, Paris green. Manufacturers tweaked the formula, producing a pigment with more stability and brilliance. And just like that, the stage was set for Victorian households to fall head over heels for green walls, curtains, dresses, and toys. The chemist's quiet Swedish lab had unleashed a monster far grander than he ever imagined. You can almost picture Scheele watching from the afterlife, squinting at a Victorian living room glowing with emerald wallpaper. Maybe he'd beam with pride at how beloved his invention had become. Or maybe he'd mutter, "Don't lick the walls, people," before wandering back to his flasks. Still, his legacy is undeniable. One man's curiosity, one flick of copper and arsenic in a flask, reshaped the way millions lived and decorated. It's a reminder of how progress often carries shadows, brilliance tinged with danger, beauty laced with poison. And in this case, the poison was literally baked into the paint. As you leave the dim Swedish lab behind and step once more into Victorian streets, you realize the pigment's journey is only just beginning. For now, it's still just a chemical marvel, waiting to be woven into wallpapers, brushed onto walls, and sewn into silks. Soon, though, the deadly consequences will follow, tucked neatly behind patterns of roses, vines, and trellises that seem so innocent, so alive, so terribly green. You step into a Victorian parlour, the heavy curtains drawn to block the London fog outside, and your eyes are instantly stolen by the walls. Every surface shimmers with patterned wallpaper, emerald vines twisting across golden backgrounds, blossoms frozen in perpetual bloom. At first, it feels like you've wandered into an indoor garden. Then, after a few breaths, your throat scratches. The wallpaper is biting back. The craze for wallpaper in 19th century Britain was unstoppable. Thanks to advances in printing, manufacturers could churn out elaborate designs at prices even middle-class families could afford. It was a revolution, no longer plain plaster or a simple coat of paint, but entire walls dressed in fantasy landscapes. And nothing sold better than green. Whether it was delicate ivy, lush ferns, or ornate damask, the favorite pigment was arsenic-laden Scheele's or Paris green. You imagine yourself leaning close to the wall. Tiny flecks of pigment cling to the paper's surface, and when the room grows damp, say from coal-fired heating or a leaky ceiling, those flecks loosen, drifting invisibly into the air. Each breath draws them deeper into your lungs. That nagging cough you've had for weeks. It isn't the fog. It's your fashionable wallpaper. Historians still argue whether Victorians genuinely suspected their wallpaper of poisoning them or if they were too dazzled to care. Some physicians raised alarms as early as the 1830s, pointing out that patients mysteriously improved when moved away from green rooms. But merchants and decorators dismissed these claims, insisting it was all superstition. After all, who wants to admit their glamorous parlor is slowly killing them? Here's a quirky tidbit. Some households actually noticed that insects refused to crawl on green wallpaper. Flies and bedbugs, otherwise a nuisance, steered clear. Families thought it was a blessing. How clever to pick a color that kept pests at bay. They didn't realize the bugs were simply smarter than they were, avoiding a pigment that reeked of danger. Imagine choosing decor that doubles as bug repellent and lethal air freshener. The stories that emerged from these emerald parlors are eerie. In one famous account, a young woman grew steadily weaker, plagued by headaches and nausea. Her doctors puzzled over her decline until someone suggested tearing down the wallpaper. Once removed, her health returned. Newspapers pounced, gleefully warning readers that their beloved green and gold designs might be silent assassins. Yet, paradoxically, sales barely dipped. The shade was too enchanting to resist. You pause in the middle of a parlor, candlelight flickering against the glittering vines on the wall. Imagine being a Victorian host, proud of your expensive decor. Guests arrive, gasp in admiration, sip their sherry, and whisper enviously about your taste. Meanwhile, everyone's eyes sting just a little, their throats a touch sore. But nobody complains, it would be rude. Illness was private business, while fashion was public glory. Factories fed this obsession. Wallpaper rolls stretched for miles, their surfaces stamped with floral arabesques in arsenic greens, deep crimsons, and lapis blues. Workers, often women and children, handled pigments barehanded, brushing away excess powder that clung stubbornly to their clothes and hair. Many grew sick, coughing violently or developing strange sores, but employers rarely connected their ailments to the product. Weak lungs, they'd mutter, as if the air itself, not the powder, were guilty. What fascinates you most is how ordinary the danger looked. Poison wasn't delivered in a sinister vial marked with skull and crossbones, it was right there, stitched into domestic normalcy. Families gathered for Christmas dinners beneath garlands of arsenic holly on their wallpaper. Children learned their alphabet sitting against green walls in schoolrooms. Lovers exchanged whispered promises in drawing rooms heavy with invisible toxins. Beauty made the threat invisible. And then there were the truly grim rumors that damp wallpaper released not just dust, but arsenic gas, fumes potent enough to cause dizziness or even collapse. Some doctors insisted this was impossible, others swore they had witnessed it firsthand. The debate continues even now, with chemists testing old wallpaper samples in sterile labs to see whether Victorian homes were basically unintentional gas chambers. Still, you can imagine the quiet terror once the suspicion began to spread. How many families, lying awake at night, stared at their walls and wondered whether beauty had betrayed them? And how many ignored the fear, too in love with the lush green glow to tear it down? Vanity often wins over caution. Tonight, as you settle deeper into your chair, picture those parlors glowing with candlelight, laughter echoing while invisible dust drifts in lazy spirals. The green vines look so alive you could almost pluck them. But every breath carries a little more arsenic into your body, and slowly, invisibly, the wallpaper claims its price. You leave the shimmering parlor and drift into a bustling ballroom, the kind where chandeliers blaze with gaslight and the music of a string quartet ripples through the air. The floor swirls with color, silks, satins, and taffetas catching the light like jewels. And among all the hues, one dominates: green. Dresses ripple in shades from moss to emerald, skirts so wide they sweep across the polished floor like waves. They're breathtaking, hypnotic, and, of course, lethal. Victorian fashion adored drama, and nothing screamed modern elegance like a gown dyed with Paris green. The pigment clung to fabric with astonishing brilliance, making dresses shimmer as if lit from within. You watch as ladies twirl, each movement releasing a faint cloud of dust from their gowns. Tiny specks catch the candlelight for a moment before vanishing into the lungs of whoever stands nearest. Congratulations, you've just inhaled a party favor. Historians still argue whether the women wearing these gowns understood the risk. Some evidence suggests they knew at least a little. Dressmakers sometimes complained of sore throats, nausea, or burns on their hands from handling the fabric. But beauty was power, and in a society where women were often judged first and fiercest on appearance, few were willing to sacrifice style for safety. After all, what's a rash compared to outshining your rivals at the ball? Here's a quirky tidbit. One fashion critic nicknamed certain green dresses killer gowns. The phrase wasn't just witty, it was worryingly accurate. There's even a tale of a young woman whose vibrant dress poisoned not only herself but her dance partner, who complained of illness after pressing clothes during a waltz. Imagine trying to be charming while your date's frock is slowly sabotaging your respiratory system. Talk about a toxic relationship. The textile industry, always hungry for novelty, leaned into the craze. Advertisements promised shades of unrivaled sparkle and unsurpassed freshness, practically daring women not to buy. Dressmakers used arsenic dyes not just in gowns but in gloves, bonnets, shoes, even artificial flowers worn in the hair. A whole outfit could be a coordinated poison ensemble. You'd look dazzling at the theater, of course, until the coughing fit started. Fashion had another quirk: it moved quickly. Today's must-have shade could be passé within a year. That urgency only fueled the obsession with green. To be without it was to risk being labeled outdated, unfashionable, even provincial. Imagine showing up at a soiree in a safe but drab brown gown while every other woman sparkled like a jewel box. Social death, some would say, and in Victorian society, that often felt worse than the physical kind. Yet not everyone was enchanted. A few critics warned that the craze was excessive, that such vibrant shades looked artificial, even garish. But their voices were drowned out by the rustle of skirts and the applause of onlookers dazzled by green's brilliance. The ballroom became a stage where arsenic was the star performer, and nobody wanted to leave the play early. You pause near the edge of the dance floor and notice something unsettling. A young woman, radiant in her emerald gown, discreetly wipes her brow. Her skin looks slightly mottled, her eyes glassy. She smiles bravely, but her steps falter. Later, perhaps, she'll collapse in her carriage, chalked up to nerves or exhaustion. Few will connect the dots between her fading health and her glittering wardrobe. The irony, of course, is that the very color associated with vitality, green, the shade of life, growth, and spring, was quietly draining life away. Society loved the symbolism: To wear green was to embody freshness, youth, natural beauty. Yet beneath the symbolism lurked a powder that corroded skin, inflamed lungs, and gnawed at health one glittering night at a time. Even men weren't spared. Waistcoats, cravats, and socks came dyed in arsenic green, flaunted by dandies eager to outshine their rivals. Imagine a gentleman tipping his hat, unaware that his fashionable scarf was dusting poison across his collar. Vanity knew no gender, arsenic catered equally to both. And all the while, dressmakers bore the worst of it. Seamstresses stitched late into the night, fingers raw from handling dyed fabrics. Some developed ulcers on their skin where the pigment rubbed in. Their misery rarely made headlines. Customers saw only the final product, the glorious gown, the perfect shade. The suffering stitched into each seam remained invisible, hidden behind layers of satin and social ambition. As you step back from the glittering crowd, the music swells, violins soaring. The dancers whirl, gowns flashing brilliant green with every turn. To the eye, it's enchanting, almost magical. But the longer you watch, the more you feel the room closing in, the air thick with unseen particles. The ballroom sparkles, yes, but beneath the glamour lies a haze of poison. And everyone is too busy applauding the beauty to notice. You wander away from the ballroom and into a quieter street, where the glow of fashion fades into the warmth of nurseries and bakeries. Here, the obsession with green takes on an even stranger, almost sinister edge. Because it isn't just wallpaper and gowns that carry arsenic's shimmer, it's toys, candies, and cakes. And that means the smallest, most vulnerable Victorians are part of the story. Picture a toy shop window on a foggy morning. Painted soldiers stand in neat ranks, their jackets a dazzling green. Wooden blocks gleam in shades so bright they almost look edible. And nestled in the corner, a dollhouse sits with walls painted in Paris green, tiny wallpapers patterned with arsenic ivy. Children press their noses to the glass, eyes wide. The color is irresistible, playtime itself transformed into a toxic spectacle. Historians still argue whether manufacturers truly didn't know, or simply didn't care. Some suggest it was ignorance, others point to profit margins that drowned out caution. What's certain is that green found its way into nurseries across Britain, coating alphabet blocks, rattles, even painted books. Imagine a toddler chewing on the corner of a bright green toy, gums pressing against wood dusted with arsenic. Teething pain solved by poison, and the parents never suspect a thing. One quirky tidbit: some children's sweets were deliberately colored with arsenic green to make them more appealing. A cake decorated with green frosting seemed fresher, more fun, perfect for birthdays. There's a famous account of a sweet shop where dozens of children fell ill after eating brightly iced buns. The baker swore he had no idea his coloring powder contained poison. He'd simply bought it from a supplier who promised it was safe. In fairness, this was an era where labeling laws were basically non-existent. If the box said vibrant green, that was good enough. You peer into a Victorian bakery. The air smells of warm bread, sugar, and just a faint tang of something sharper. On the counter, rows of pastries gleam with colored icing. Children dash in, coins clutched in sticky hands, and walk out triumphantly with cakes glowing green. Within hours, their parents might be calling for the doctor, puzzled at sudden cramps and vomiting. The sweets looked so harmless, so festive. Meanwhile, upstairs in a nursery, a child sprawls on a rug patterned with green leaves. He coughs, his skin pale, while his mother flutters nervously nearby. It must be a chill from the window, she tells herself, never suspecting the rug beneath him is releasing poison into the air. Even the toys strewn around him, painted in cheerful shades, are part of the assault. The Victorian nursery, meant to be the safest haven, is in truth a minefield of toxins. The irony stings. Victorians often prided themselves on their devotion to children, crafting elaborate toys and clothing to show affection. Yet in chasing beauty and novelty, they delivered arsenic into the hands of toddlers. One wonders if parents ever noticed patterns: the child who grew sicker after long hours in the nursery, or the little girl whose cough grew worse whenever she played with her favorite dollhouse. But suspicion rarely turned to wallpaper or paint. Disease was everywhere in Victorian Britain: cholera, diphtheria, scarlet fever. Illness had countless suspects. The toy box never made the list. And yet, not all voices were silent. By the mid-19th century, a few doctors began sounding alarms, whispering about green sickness in children. They observed rashes, stomach pains, and mysterious fevers. Sometimes, removing a child from a green-decorated room seemed to help. But evidence was scattered, anecdotal, easy for merchants to dismiss as coincidence. A child recovers, the wallpaper stays, the cycle repeats. You crouch beside a wooden rocking horse painted with streaks of emerald. Its maner is carved with care, its saddle decorated. A boy clutches the reins, rocking back and forth, laughter filling the room. And yet, the paint flakes slightly under his fingers, tiny particles drifting unseen. His joy is real, but so is the danger. It's a haunting contradiction, the innocence of play entwined with the shadow of poison. Factories churned out more and more toys and confections, the green brighter each year. Parents bought them gladly, wanting their children to have the latest wonders. No one wanted to believe that joy could carry a hidden cost. But you can't shake the feeling as you leave the toy shop and bakery behind. Each sparkling sweet, each cheerful toy, is another quiet whisper of arsenic working its way into young lives. You step into a dimly lit surgery, the smell of carbolic acid and coal smoke mingling in the air. A doctor in a stiff collar leans over his patient, scribbling notes with one hand while holding a watch to time her pulse with the other. His brow furrows. The symptoms are frustratingly vague: headaches, nausea, fatigue, rashes, a peculiar cough. It looks like everything and nothing at once. And then, his gaze flicks to the bright green wallpaper surrounding the bed, the curtains, even the lampshade. Could beauty itself be the culprit? By the mid-19th century, more and more physicians were starting to wonder if arsenic was silently waging war in their patients' homes. Cases piled up where illnesses improved after people left their richly decorated parlors. Doctors compared notes in journals, whispering about a mysterious influence lurking in fashionable houses. Some called it the green disease. Others insisted it was all hysteria. Historians still argue whether the medical profession acted bravely early on, or whether most looked away until the evidence became overwhelming. The medical world wasn't unified. Some doctors were bold enough to write scathing reports, warning families to rip down their green wallpapers immediately. Others hesitated, worried about their reputations. Imagine being a Victorian physician and telling a wealthy client, "Yes, madam, your stunning French wallpaper is slowly poisoning your children." Not exactly the kind of diagnosis that wins repeat business. One quirky tidbit: a German physician, in one particularly dramatic demonstration, brought a scrap of green wallpaper into his lecture hall. He poured hot water over it, and the audience watched in horror as steam rose carrying arsenic fumes. Within minutes, several students felt lightheaded. The point was clear: if a classroom experiment could do this, imagine what an entire house might achieve over months or years. Of course, not every doctor agreed. Some waved away the idea as fashionable paranoia. They pointed to the vagueness of symptoms. Wasn't everyone in industrial Britain coughing, fainting, or dizzy at some point? Coal smoke, poor diets, overwork, take your pick. Why blame a harmless-looking wall when 1,000 other dangers crowded daily life? This denial bought manufacturers more time to sell their green wares. Still, cases mounted. Children wasting away in nurseries. Seamstresses collapsing at their work tables. Families mysteriously healthier after redecorating with plainer colors. Medical journals filled with warnings, sometimes cloaked in cautious language, sometimes blunt as a hammer. Remove the source, or the patient will not recover. A few brave doctors even testified in court, supporting lawsuits against wallpaper companies. And you can imagine the pushback. Merchants rolled their eyes, insisting these doctors were exaggerating to make headlines. If our wallpapers were truly dangerous, they argued, wouldn't the entire nation be dead by now? It was the same tune industries play even today: deny, distract, delay. The science was inconvenient, and business thrived on inconvenience being ignored. You stand beside a patient lying weakly in bed, her hands clutching the covers. She whispers that she feels better when she visits her sister's plain whitewashed house. Her doctor nods gravely, making a note. He suspects the wallpaper but hesitates to order its removal. What if he's wrong? What if it's something else entirely? Medicine in this era is as much guesswork as science. Yet, you feel the unspoken truth lingering in the room. The green walls loom like silent predators, their vines and blossoms painted with lethal calm. This period marks the slow turning of the tide. For the first time, medical voices are chipping away at society's denial. Not fast enough to save everyone, of course, but enough to plant seeds of suspicion. Families begin to whisper, could it be the wallpaper? And once the question takes root, it's hard to unask. As you step out of the surgery into the night, the fog feels cleaner than the air inside those green rooms. Doctors are raising alarms, yes, but the battle is only beginning. The wallpaper still glows, the dresses still shimmer, and the toys still gleam. But now, tucked into the shadows, the first warnings echo, soft, skeptical, and persistent. You drift into the chatter of a Victorian parlor, not the genteel kind where ladies sip tea, but the sharp-tongued realm of newspapers and political pamphlets. Here, the danger of green becomes public debate, ink on paper, voices in the street, whispers over pub counters. The press, always hungry for scandal, seizes on the story with relish. Poison in the drawing room, one headline screams. Another, more theatrical. Death lurks behind the wallpaper. Victorians, you realize, never missed an opportunity for a melodramatic exclamation mark. Journalists, both earnest and sensational, spread tales of families sickened in their finely decorated homes. Some stories are surely exaggerated, but others ring chillingly true. You picture a reporter pounding away on a typewriter, cigarette smoke curling above him, grinning at the thought of readers shuddering over breakfast. Papers compete to outdo each other. Who can find the deadliest anecdote, the most lurid tale of a child felled by wallpaper? It's not exactly medical science, but it sure sells copies. And yet, public opinion starts to sway. When you read the morning paper and see that fashionable green wallpaper might be as deadly as cholera, you think twice before ordering a new roll. Or at least, you pretend to think twice while still admiring the neighbor's shimmering parlor. Historians still argue whether the press helped save lives by spreading awareness, or whether they merely whipped up a panic without offering real solutions. One quirky tidbit: some newspapers even ran ads for arsenic-free wallpapers right next to articles describing wallpaper deaths. Imagine sipping your morning tea, horrified by a story of children fainting in a green nursery, then glancing at the next column. By our new safe wallpaper, guaranteed fashionable and non-lethal. It was fear-mongering and marketing hand in hand, Victorian capitalism at its most ironic. Pamphleteers joined in, printing tracts with dramatic titles like Shadows on the Wall or The Green Menace in Our Homes. These were often written by reform-minded doctors, crusading journalists, or just enthusiastic moralists who loved wagging fingers at society's indulgences. Some pamphlets included chemical diagrams or instructions on how to test wallpaper scraps at home. Others leaned more on fire and brimstone rhetoric, warning that parents who ignored the threat were practically sentencing their children. Of course, plenty of defenders fought back. Manufacturers placed ads declaring their products perfectly safe, dismissing the panic as French nonsense or German exaggerations. Blaming foreigners was always fashionable in Victorian Britain. They argued that only careless households suffered, or that doctors misdiagnosed illnesses caused by poor hygiene, not paint. The public was left caught in the middle, bombarded by dueling narratives, green as glamour versus green as death. You imagine a Victorian family around the breakfast table. The father folds his paper, muttering about scare stories. The mother, anxious but stylish, wonders aloud whether they should redecorate the nursery. Their daughter, munching toast, announces she rather likes the green roses on her wall. And so the debate trickles down into domestic life, shaping choices, planting doubts. Public lectures fueled the flames. Reformers demonstrated arsenic fumes to packed audiences, just as doctors had in their classrooms. Attendees gasped, fanned themselves, and left vowing never to touch green wallpaper again. Yet just as many walked away thinking it was overblown, another fashionable scare like haunted houses or mesmerism. You can almost hear the city's divided murmur, one side warning, the other scoffing, everyone secretly glancing at their own walls. The press had done its job. It turned a chemical issue into a social storm. For the first time, the question of arsenic wasn't confined to doctors and patients. It belonged to the public, pulsing in headlines, gossip, and dinner table arguments. And as you stroll past a newsstand stacked with papers shouting about poison, you realize the green craze isn't just a matter of taste anymore. It's a battle of words, reputations, and who the public decides to trust. You turn a corner and find yourself in a long, echoing hall, the kind where wealthy patrons host exhibitions to show off the marvels of industry. Rows of wallpapers hang like trophies, bolts of fabric draped across polished tables, ribbons cascading in brilliant, shimmering green. Visitors stroll through with parasols tucked under their arms, gas lamps glinting off the colors. It looks like progress itself, modernity unfurling in shades of emerald and jade. But you know better. Each shimmering roll is a silent hazard, waiting to be pasted onto someone's parlor wall. Manufacturers, proud of their chemistry, boasted endlessly about the intensity of their greens. Brochures promised colors that would never fade, hues so bright they'd dazzle even in candlelight. Salesmen rolled out samples in drawing rooms, urging families to keep up with the latest fashion. After all, in an age of constant change, steam trains, telegraphs, photography, why should your home remain dull? Green was the color of progress, vitality, wealth. Historians still argue whether the merchants truly believed their reassurances or knowingly spun lies. Some factory owners swore they had scientific proof their wallpapers were harmless, while others quietly paid off critics and printed new labels without changing the formula. Either way, arsenic production ramped up, churned out in barrels, ground into powders, and stirred into vats of pigment destined for parlors across Europe. One quirky tidbit: wallpaper samples were often displayed in albums for customers to flip through, like giant fashion catalogs. A popular pastime for ladies' groups was gathering to browse new patterns, running fingers over the embossed leaves and flowers. Picture them sighing over a brilliant ivy design, never realizing they're literally stroking poison onto their gloves. It's like a Victorian version of window shopping at a snake pit. The sales rooms themselves became sites of drama. Some reform-minded physicians stormed in, demanding that arsenic wallpapers be pulled from the shelves. Shopkeepers scoffed, dismissing them as alarmists. Meanwhile, fashionable customers defended their purchases with a mix of pride and denial. Surely, if it were dangerous, the Queen herself wouldn't allow it in Windsor. Spoiler: some reports suggest that even royal residences were not entirely free of arsenical decor. As competition grew fierce, manufacturers resorted to marketing stunts. Advertisements declared their wallpapers pure and safe, plastered with pseudoscientific jargon. Rival companies accused one another of secretly using arsenic, even while quietly doing the same. It was a green arms race, each brand scrambling to outshine the others in brilliance, no matter the cost. And yet, the dangers wouldn't stay buried. Salesmen began to notice awkward moments, customers fainting in newly papered rooms, seamstresses coughing uncontrollably while working with fabric samples. Lawsuits trickled in, often hushed by settlements. Behind the glittering showroom facade, cracks in the story widened. You pause beside a towering rack of wallpaper, the patterns repeating endlessly: roses, ivy, palm fronds, all blazing green. Imagine a young couple proudly selecting a design for their first nursery, unaware that they're choosing months of illness. The salesman beams, convinced he's selling beauty and comfort. The truth hangs unspoken in the air: this business thrives not just on color, but on denial. And so the marketplace hums on, a strange theater where fashion collides with chemistry, and the show must go on. Green still reigns supreme, shimmering across every surface. But behind the confidence of the merchants, you sense a nervous undercurrent. The louder they boast, the more fragile their empire feels. You leave the wallpaper halls behind and step into a bustling Victorian city street. It's not the glittering world of mansions and parlors anymore, it's the soot-stained neighborhoods where seamstresses, bakers, and factory hands live. And here, the story of arsenic takes on an even harsher edge. If the wealthy were slowly poisoned by fashion, the working class was poisoned by their livelihoods. Factories that produced arsenic pigments were brutal places. You picture rows of workers grinding minerals into fine powder, the air thick with a glittering green haze. They cough and wipe their hands on aprons already stained emerald. There are no masks, no fans, no safety codes. Every breath pulls arsenic deeper into their lungs. Some workers called the powder the devil's dust, and you can understand why. Historians still argue whether Victorian society turned a blind eye out of ignorance or because labourers were considered expendable. After all, arsenic production boomed, miners hauled it out of Cornwall, chemical plants refined it, and factories blended it into pigments. The demand for green meant steady wages, however dangerous. For many families, sickness was the cost of survival. One quirky tidbit: some workers' hair reportedly turned a faint greenish tint after long exposure to pigment dust. Imagine clocking out of your shift and catching your reflection, your hair shimmering like a fairy tale villain, except it's not magic, just slow poisoning. Seamstresses faced their own dangers. In cramped workshops, they stitched dresses from arsenic-dyed fabrics, their needles slipping through cloth that shed invisible particles. Long hours bent over gowns meant headaches, sore throats, rashes along their arms. Many were young girls, some barely teenagers, lured by the promise of steady work. You can almost see them pausing to rub their temples, giggling softly despite the fatigue, unaware of how much damage their glamorous fabrics inflict. Street vendors sold artificial flowers, each leaf and petal brushed with Paris green to look fresh forever. Poor women often made these flowers by hand, dipping and painting until their fingers blistered. A cheap bouquet for a fashionable lady often came at the cost of another woman's health. Doctors noticed clusters of sickness among these workers, but few reforms followed quickly. Profit, once again, outweighed compassion. And yet, the working class was not entirely voiceless. Radical pamphlets circulated, linking factory illnesses to greed and negligence. Early labor activists demanded better protections, though their cries were faint against the roar of industry. The irony bites: aristocrats fainting in their parlors became headlines, while entire neighborhoods of sick workers barely registered. You walk through a narrow alley where children chase one another past laundry lines. A little boy stops to cough, his breath rattling. His mother, bent over her sewing table, waves him off. She's too busy finishing a gown for a wealthy client to notice. Her fingertips are sore, her skin blotched with red patches. She'll deliver the dress tomorrow, smiling faintly despite the pain. And somewhere uptown, a lady will wear it to a ball, glowing in green under gaslight, never thinking of the hands that stitched it. The contrast is brutal. Luxury on one end, labor on the other, both poisoned by the same pigment but in vastly different ways. For the wealthy, arsenic is a hidden danger wrapped in elegance. For the poor, it's a daily hazard woven into survival. And as you walk away from the alley, you can't shake the sense that the color green here is less a fashion statement and more a cruel joke played on those with the least power to resist. You step into a lecture hall buzzing with anticipation. The benches creak as curious onlookers settle in, students, socialites, even a few skeptical merchants hoping to prove the fuss over arsenic is just another Victorian fad. At the front, a chemist in a black frock coat clears his throat and gestures to a series of jars, powders, and wallpaper scraps. Tonight's entertainment isn't a magic show or a melodrama. It's science on stage, and the subject is poison in your parlor. By the late 19th century, chemistry had become something of a spectacle. Public demonstrations were as much about showmanship as knowledge. Scientists boiled wallpaper scraps in water and passed the liquid around in vials, inviting the audience to sniff. A faint garlic-like odor clung to the air, the telltale sign of arsenic vapors. Gasps and murmurs rippled through the crowd. Some clutched handkerchiefs to their faces, others leaned in with morbid fascination. You can almost hear the whispers, "Could this really be wafting off my walls right now?" Historians still argue whether these demonstrations were more science or theater. They certainly spread awareness, but they also thrived on drama. A few chemists relished the shock value, drawing out suspense before revealing the deadly truth. The effect was powerful. Once you've watched a scrap of wallpaper bubble up fumes that make your throat itch, it's hard to go home and relax under your own floral pattern. One quirky tidbit: some lecturers carried small cages of mice or birds. They would expose the animals to wallpaper fumes mid-lecture, and sure enough, the creatures staggered or fell limp within minutes. It was grisly but effective. Victorian audiences had a taste for the sensational, and nothing drove the point home like a poor canary toppling over in real time. The debate spilled beyond lecture halls into salons and dinner parties. Amateur chemists began experimenting at home, testing wallpapers with vinegar, heat, or even their own noses. It became almost a parlor game, guests daring one another to sniff a teacup of boiled wallpaper water. Imagine that, instead of charades, your evening's entertainment is a round of who gets dizzy first. Manufacturers scrambled to defend themselves. They dismissed these demonstrations as exaggerations, claiming the experiments didn't reflect real household conditions. "No one boils their wallpaper," they sneered in pamphlets. But the damage was done. Public faith wavered, and suspicion seeped in with every newspaper article about another daring lecture. And through it all, scientists themselves debated. Was the danger truly from the arsenic pigment itself, or from mold and dampness releasing it into the air? Were the amounts deadly, or merely irritating? These questions mattered, because admitting that wallpaper itself could kill meant rewriting the rules of domestic life. It wasn't just coal smoke and sores outside that posed a threat, it was the very walls of your home. You watch the chemist hold up a roll of green fabric to the gaslight, letting it shimmer one last time before tossing it into a basin of hot water. Steam rises, and the audience leans forward. Some cough, others mutter prayers. A lady faints theatrically into her husband's arms. The demonstration ends, but the unease lingers, carried out into the foggy night as attendees walk home, suddenly suspicious of every green surface they pass. And you can feel it too, that creeping shift in awareness. Once seen, it cannot be unseen. Once smelled, it cannot be unsmelled. The stage show of science has cracked the illusion of harmless beauty. The wallpaper may still hang, the gowns may still glitter, but trust in green is beginning to fray. You find yourself in a cavernous Victorian courtroom, where the air buzzes with tension thicker than the coal smoke outside. Barristers in powdered wigs shuffle papers, clerks rattle pens, and a restless audience leans forward, eager for spectacle. This isn't just another dispute over inheritance or unpaid debts. No, today's drama is about wallpaper and whether beauty has been killing people in their own homes. As industry thrived, so did the lawsuits. Families brought claims against merchants, insisting their illnesses vanished once arsenic wallpaper was stripped away. Doctors testified, sometimes nervously, that symptoms matched poisoning. Merchants defended themselves fiercely, waving sales records and insisting their goods were safe. The stakes were high, not just money, but reputations, and perhaps the very definition of progress itself. Historians still argue whether these trials truly threatened the wallpaper industry or were more symbolic, a stage where public anxiety played out. Few cases actually toppled manufacturers, but each one chipped away at trust. When you hear testimony about children coughing themselves sick in a nursery lined with emerald ivy, it's hard to shrug it off as coincidence. One quirky tidbit: in one London trial, a lawyer reportedly unfurled a roll of wallpaper right there in court, demanding the jury take a deep whiff. Within minutes, several jurors were coughing, one fanning himself furiously. The judge, unimpressed, ordered the offending roll removed, but the effect lingered. Nothing makes a point like choking on the evidence. Courtrooms became arenas for spectacle as much as justice. Reporters filled columns with the juiciest details: trembling witnesses, dramatic fainting fits, merchants sputtering in outrage. Readers lapped it up like serialized fiction. The courtroom, in many ways, was an extension of the theater, and arsenic wallpaper provided the perfect villain: elegant, silent, and everywhere. Yet legal outcomes were murky. Juries hesitated to condemn powerful industries outright. Merchants often escaped with fines, or settlements tucked discreetly out of sight. The government, wary of stifling commerce, dragged its feet on passing firm regulations. Reformers grew frustrated, pointing to each ambiguous verdict as proof that profit outweighed human health. You picture a witness stand where a seamstress testifies in a trembling voice. She describes headaches and burning skin after sewing gowns dyed with Paris green. The barrister cross-examines her coldly, suggesting her illness comes from women's nerves rather than arsenic. The audience murmurs, some sympathetic, others skeptical. The verdict may not favor her, but her story adds another thread to the growing tapestry of public doubt. Meanwhile, manufacturers doubled down on marketing. Courtroom defeats were brushed aside as isolated incidents. Advertisements still promised safe and modern colors, printed ironically beside newspaper reports of yet another suspicious death. The disconnect was dizzying, but very Victorian, a society that could hold both fascination and fear in the same breath. You linger in the courtroom as the gavel strikes, echoing against high stone walls. Another case closes, another headline waits to be printed. Justice feels slippery, more performance than protection. And yet, with every lawsuit, every public argument, the pressure builds. The arsenic green empire may not crumble today, but the cracks are widening, and everyone can hear them spreading through the silence. You slip into a grand Victorian dining room, where gilt chandeliers glitter overhead and the table stretches long enough to seat 24 guests. Crystal glasses catch the lamplight, silverware gleams, and platters of roast beef and custards line the linen. The guests laugh, sip wine, and exchange gossip. Yet as you take a seat, your eyes drift to the surroundings: the deep green drapes, the velvet chairs, the wallpaper blooming with emerald vines. Poison, once again, sets the backdrop for luxury. By the late 1800s, Awareness of arsenic had seeped into polite society, but denial clung stubbornly. Wealthy households balanced uneasily between fashion and fear. Hosts boasted of their elegant green decor, while whispering that some silly doctors exaggerated its dangers. Guests politely ignored the faint tickle in their throats, unwilling to insult their hosts or admit unease. It was a theater of manners, where silence kept the poison in place. Historians still argue whether the upper classes clung to arsenic greens out of true ignorance or sheer stubborn vanity. After all, green had become a symbol of refinement. Abandoning it might feel like surrendering status. And in a world obsessed with appearances, what was a little nausea compared to social disgrace? One quirky tidbit: some dinner hosts reportedly bragged that their wallpapers were absolutely arsenic-free, the way modern hosts might boast about organic wine or cruelty-free cheese. Of course, no one could be entirely sure. Guests nodded approvingly, still suspicious, still breathing carefully, still wondering if dessert came with a side of invisible fumes. In middle-class homes, the dilemma was just as sharp. A modest family might save for years to redecorate their parlor, and when the time came, who could resist the vibrant green patterns so loudly advertised as the mark of taste? If sickness followed, blame fell on bad weather, weak constitutions, or even divine punishment, anything but the costly wallpaper they had proudly hung. Children, as always, bore the brunt. Nurseries decorated in fashionable greens looked charming but left little ones listless and coughing. Mothers soothed them with tonics, never daring to suspect the cheerful vines and blossoms painted above the crib. Meanwhile, servants who dusted or laundered these rooms daily inhaled even more poison, suffering quietly without complaint. Their illnesses rarely made headlines, too ordinary, too invisible. You picture a dinner guest shifting uncomfortably, his head throbbing as conversation drones on. He wonders if it's the wine, the rich food, or perhaps just fatigue. He certainly doesn't lean across the table and whisper, "Actually, I think your wallpaper's killing me." Victorian etiquette demanded politeness even in the face of danger. Better to faint discreetly on the cab ride home than embarrass a hostess. And yet, cracks in the facade grew. Satirical cartoons mocked wealthy families swooning in green-draped parlors. Magazines published darkly humorous illustrations of skulls hidden in floral wallpaper. The joke was biting. Fashion had blinded society to its own slow poisoning. Awareness seeped in, but change moved at a crawl, strangled by pride and aesthetics. As you leave the dining room, the laughter echoes behind you, muffled by heavy green curtains. The guests will finish their meals, compliment the decor, and head home feeling vaguely ill. No one will speak of the poison clinging to the velvet, but everyone will sense it. That was the strange Victorian compromise, luxury with a side of denial, a glittering feast set against invisible danger. You wander now through the halls of power, where green no longer clings only to parlors and ballrooms but creeps into parliamentary debates and scientific societies. By the late 19th century, the arsenic question had grown too loud to ignore. Politicians, scientists, reformers all found themselves dragged into the fray. Was it finally time to tame the green monster? Or would commerce keep its grip a little longer? In Westminster, members of Parliament rose to debate what many newspapers were already calling the arsenic peril. Some argued passionately for restrictions, insisting the government had a duty to protect families from invisible dangers lurking in their homes. Others scoffed, waving their hands as though swatting a fly. "Are we to outlaw colors now?" they demanded. "Shall we ban roses because their thorns prick?" The chamber filled with laughter, but beneath the jokes lingered unease. Historians still argue whether the government's reluctance stemmed from ignorance, pressure from wealthy manufacturers, or simple fear of disrupting trade. After all, arsenic wasn't just in wallpaper, it fueled agriculture, medicine, rat poison, and dyes. To regulate it fully meant rewriting the rulebook of Victorian industry. One quirky tidbit: some reformers staged exhibitions of arsenic-free products, proudly labeling wallpapers and fabrics as safe alternatives. It was a curious foreshadowing of modern organic or non-toxic branding. Visitors toured these displays with cautious optimism, yet the lure of Paris green remained strong. The toxic version still shimmered brighter, and fashion was rarely swayed by safety labels alone. Scientific societies issued reports, some cautious, some damning. Chemists argued over quantities: was a little arsenic harmless? Was wallpaper only deadly when damp? Was illness really caused by poison, or by weak nerves? These questions mattered, because answers shaped policy. But the debates dragged on, leaving families to decorate blindly in the meantime. Internationally, other nations stirred too. Germany passed restrictions earlier than Britain, forcing some English manufacturers to quietly adjust recipes for export while continuing to sell the dangerous versions at home. Critics pounced on this hypocrisy. If it was too unsafe for Berlin, why was it fine for London? Merchants, of course, muttered about different climates and foreign exaggerations. Parliamentary committees heard testimony from doctors who described pale, coughing children wasting away in nurseries, and from widows who swore their husbands had been killed by the very walls of their homes. Industry spokesmen countered with polished denials, claiming hysteria and coincidence. The battle was words against words, evidence against profit. You imagine a weary reformer standing before Parliament, papers shaking in his hand, his voice echoing in the chamber: "We are poisoning our people for the sake of fashion." Behind him, rows of MPs murmur, some sympathetic, others smirking. Votes stall, bills wither, and the Green Empire survives another season. Still, momentum builds. Public health advocates, emboldened by growing scientific evidence, refused to let the matter drop. Campaigns spread pamphlets, lectures, even children's rhymes warning of the deadly green. By the century's end, arsenic wallpaper had shifted from fashionable must-have to whispered liability. The tide hadn't fully turned, but it had begun to swell. As you leave the smoky halls of Parliament, you feel the weight of politics pressing down. Progress in Victorian Britain often moved like molasses, slow, sticky, and shaped by the tug of money. And yet, you sense the Green's reign beginning to falter. What was once dazzling now carried too much suspicion, too many fainting fits and funeral whispers. The empire of arsenic still glittered, but its brilliance was dimming. You walk into the twilight of the Victorian age, where fashions shift, science sharpens, and the once glorious green begins its slow retreat. The parlors are still there, the wallpapers still bloom with ivy and roses, but now their brilliance seems haunted. What was once admired without question is eyed with suspicion. The great quest for the perfect shade of green has reached its strange, poisonous climax. Manufacturers, feeling the pressure of scandals, lawsuits, and Parliament's halting debates, begin to pivot. New pigments emerge, safer, if duller. Advertisements trumpet non-arsenical wallpapers and fabrics, careful to reassure nervous buyers. Some houses proudly redecorate, stripping their arsenic papers as if shedding snakeskin. Others quietly let the fashion fade, unwilling to admit they ever hung poison on their walls in the first place. Historians still argue whether the downfall of arsenic green came from science, politics, or simply the whims of fashion. Perhaps it was all three: doctors' warnings, public scandals, and the natural churn of style combining to push the color aside. What is certain is that by the dawn of the 20th century, arsenic had largely slipped from drawing rooms into history books, leaving behind both tragedy and fascination. One quirky tidbit: decades later, antique collectors discovered that rolls of 19th century arsenic wallpaper still emitted measurable poison when unrolled. Museums handling them today sometimes wear protective gloves and masks. Imagine, more than 100 years later, the deadly charm of Victorian green still lingers, waiting quietly on vellum-thin paper. As you wander through the fading century, you can almost hear the echoes, the laughter in green ballrooms, the coughs in nurseries, the whispers in Parliament. All of it woven together by a single obsession with a color too bright, too alluring, too treacherous. The quest for beauty blinded a society, and the cost was written on pale skin, in fainting fits, in small coffins carried down foggy streets. And yet, there's something hauntingly human about it, the willingness to risk health for beauty, to chase glamour even at great cost. Victorians weren't unique in this. You, too, live in a world where fashion and danger dance together. Plastics that outlast oceans, chemicals in cosmetics, dyes in fast fashion. The story of arsenic green isn't just about the past. It's a mirror, held up by flickering lamplight, showing how desire can outshine caution. Now, slow your steps. The factories fall silent, the wallpaper rolls curl in abandoned shops, and the once fevered green fades into sepia memory. The story has reached its end, and you are left with the hush that follows when a storm finally breaks. And as promised, here is your gentle wind down. The night has deepened, the hum of our story easing into quiet. Imagine those green walls dissolving now, peeling away to reveal something softer, bare plaster, pale and calm. The sharp fumes of arsenic lift, replaced by the cool drift of fresh night air. The ballrooms go still, the parlors empty, the factories close their doors. All that remains is a fading glimmer, like moonlight settling on calm water. Let your breath slow, easy and unhurried. Each inhale carries you further from the bright, choking colors of the past, and each exhale leaves the weight of history behind. The laughter, the coughing, the clatter of carriages all fade into silence. You're left only with the softness of now, the steady rhythm of your heart, and the comfort of knowing the story has folded gently shut. Rest in that quiet. Trust the stillness. The poisons of the past are only whispers now, and you are safe, drifting further into calm. The perfect green is gone, the danger with it. What remains is only the peace of this moment, soft and unbroken. Sleep well, dream deep, and may the night carry you gently.